This is a 2004 Volvo S60R, and it's one of the coolest cars that Volvo ever made. It's also an underrated sports sedan. It had some cool features, including a powerful turbo engine, a manual transmission, all-wheel drive, and some other neat benefits, like this color combination, which is the single craziest color combination ever offered by an automaker from the factory ever. At any time. I'll show you what I mean, and I'll show you everything else too, because today I'm going to review the S60R. Before I get started, big news, this S60R is currently live for sale, being auctioned on Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website. This S60R has a manual transmission, and it's in the very best colors for this car, and it's offered with no reserve. So once you finish watching this video, head down to the description, click the link to check out the live auction for this S60R, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. But let's talk S60R. Everybody knows Volvo has a great reputation for practicality and safety, but they've also made some performance cars going back years. For example, everybody loves the 850 T5R in the mid-1990s. But probably the most surprising Volvo performance car was this one, the S60R, which came out in 2004. It was surprising for a few reasons. For one, it had 300 horsepower, which was a pretty big number. Back then, that was verging on BMW M3 territory in a Volvo. This car also had all-wheel drive, which wasn't that common on performance cars at the time, and it offered a manual transmission and an adaptive chassis, which was really rare, especially at this price point. And then there was the colors, these colors. I have waited a long time to film a Volvo S60R, mostly because I was waiting for one in this color combination. And you'll find out why shortly. So let's get started. First, I'll take you on a tour of the S60R and show you all of the quirks and features of this iconic Volvo. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug score. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the S60R with probably my very favorite Volvo quirk of all time, and that would be this car's colors. You're probably wondering why I'm making such a big deal out of the colors. You can see the outside is this kind of teal, which is weird, but so what? So let's start with the outside. This is a color called flash green, and it was kind of the hero color for the S60R. It was in a lot of the advertisements and the press materials, and it was weird, especially from Volvo, and especially in 2004. Volvo did not make cars in this color. They were the safe, practical, reliable European manufacturer. Everything they made was silver or gray or maybe a brown. That was it. And then came this. But also in 2004, weird colors weren't as big of a deal as they are now. Most people got silver, white, gray, black. Porsche's paint to sample program was barely a trickle of cars. It just wasn't that big of a deal. And so flash green was a pretty crazy color, especially back then and especially for Volvo. But while flash green was certainly an unusual exterior color for this car, it was particularly notable when paired with this interior, which is bright freaking orange. Take a look at this. Bright orange interior with a bright teal exterior. Volvo called this color Atacama, and it really was Doritos orange. So incredibly bright, and it clashed unbelievably severely with the teal on the outside. So much that I have wondered over the years if Volvo really set out to find two colors that clashed as much as humanly possible just to stick them together, which they did for this car. Now, when I tell people about this color combination, they assume that the orange interior is actually like a saddle brown or sort of a rich red, because a lot of automakers do that. No, this was orange, bright orange, 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 orange. Once I've made that point clear, a lot of people assume, okay, well maybe they used the orange just for like the seat centers or the trim. No, it was the entire seat, as you can see, all orange. The headrest, the seat bottom, the backrest, and the door panels, all orange, as you can see. And even the carpeting in this interior was orange. orange carpets, orange floor mats, orange seats, orange headrests. It was all orange, and the exterior was bright teal. And when you have the car with the door open and you see those two colors together, the teal and orange right next to each other, you just have to say that this is the craziest color ever offered by an automaker. It was not some crazy special order custom thing. This was a factory color available from Volvo that you could get with this car. Now, not surprisingly, almost nobody got this color combination because it's ridiculous, and they stopped doing it after only a few years, and probably only a few hundred of these sold. But this is one of the famous cars, flash green over Atacama, the craziest factory color combination ever. But anyway, now that I've sufficiently freaked out over the teal and orange color combination, let's go over some of the rest of this car's quirks and features, because there are a few, and one notable one is the shifter situation. This car has a manual transmission, which is a big deal because previous high-performance Volvo models sold in the United States were only offered with an automatic. The 850R and the T5R, you couldn't get them with a manual here. So the S60R coming out with a manual was huge news. And the manual transmission lever was also huge news. It's this, which is called the Spaceball by Volvo enthusiasts, because it didn't have like a leather shift boot or a gate. Instead, it's this silver ball, and you just move the gear lever around, and it almost looks like some silver orb sort of suspended and moving around where you would normally have a gear lever and a shifter. It's a really, really cool look, and I don't know of anybody else who's ever really replicated it, including Volvo after this. One interesting thing about this shift lever, which I didn't really realize, the gear pattern is printed above and below the lever, as you can see, 135 on top, 246R on bottom, but they also printed it a second time to the left of the shift lever, so you can see the gear pattern once again. I guess they thought this whole setup was so unorthodox that they really had to drive home the point, this is where all the gears are, and so they put the pattern on there twice, within a couple of inches of each other, which is kind of unusual, but this was certainly an unusual shifter. And another unusual feature of this car, and kind of a cool one, it had an adaptive chassis system. You see these buttons on the top of the center control stack. You could choose whether you wanted the chassis in comfort, sport, or advanced mode, and then the suspension, the handling, the steering, everything would sort of change based on what your selection was. This was a pretty big deal for a car at this price level. Not too many vehicles here had such a thing, and this car was kind of a pioneer in that feature, which has now become a lot more common, the active chassis in the S60R. And next up, another interesting quirk in the center control stack here, the climate controls. I remember back when this car came out how cool it was that you could adjust where the air came out of the vents by just tapping this like body. You could tap the head and that would change it to the head or the middle section or the feet, and that was just so cool. Way cooler than most cars with their ugly normal little dial or switch or buttons that you would use. This thing seemed futuristic and advanced with the little body diagram that you would touch. And next up, another interesting quirk of this car, in that vicinity, you can see at the bottom of the center control stack, you have a little clip here. This is for a pen. If you needed a pen, you could store one here and clip it in place, and so you always had a pen with you wherever you were going, which was kind of neat. And speaking of little convenient clips, there was another one located on the base of the windshield on the driver's side. You can see right here. So if you went and like paid for parking and got a little receipt to show how long you paid for, you could stick it in your dashboard on this little clip facing out, which is exactly what that was designed for, to make it easy to post stuff like that in your windshield, which is kind of a cool quirk and a pretty good idea. Next up, another cool quirk also in this vicinity is the gauges. I always loved these blue gauges. Absolutely gorgeous. They looked amazing, futuristic, high quality, and they were rimmed with this silver, and it was just a fantastic look with the gauges. I always really appreciated how these looked. And to drive home the performance aspect of the car, the gauges had little R logos, but very subtle. In the bottom center, you can see one on the speedometer, one on the tachometer, and that was it. Just these little subtle R logos in there. One cool thing about this particular car, it has an aftermarket boost gauge. You can see it's mounted here above the gauge cluster, and it matches the look of the gauges. Also blue, and it even matches Volvo's font and has its own little R logo. This aftermarket tuning company, IPD, actually went to the trouble of almost making this look like a factory gauge, which is pretty cool. And all the blue gauges in this car were a neat touch. Now, one interesting thing, I mentioned mention the R logos in these gauges, but other than that, there weren't that many R logos in this car. Kind of proud of Volvo for not vastly overdoing it. In the interior, there really weren't many. You had an R logo at the base of the steering wheel, which looked cool. You also had one on the door sill. You open the door and you could see R, and on the back of the key, there was an R logo, but that was it. They didn't stick R everywhere on the shifter, on the seats. You don't have any of that stuff. It was just sort of a subtle R on the inside. And by the way, speaking of the key for this car is a little bit unorthodox. You got 5 buttons you can see, and 3 of them are pretty normal: lock, unlock, in the trunk. But then you have a red triangle and a yellow circle. The red triangle is the alarm. If you want to set the alarm off, you press that and the car starts beeping. The yellow circle is the lights. If you're walking through a parking lot, you can't find your car, you press that, it illuminates the lights, and then you can see where it's parked. It's a pretty cool idea, just kind of some unusual buttons. But anyway, next up, back to the gauges for a second. There was one interesting operation with these gauges, and it had to do with the stalks coming off the steering column. You can see on each side, left you have the turn signal stalk, pretty standard, and on the right you have the wiper stalk. And there's this little dial on the wiper stalk that controls the speed of the intermittent wipers, which pretty much all cars have, nothing unusual there. The weird part is over on the turn signal stalk, you have the very same dial, but that controls the little screen in the gauge cluster. You scroll with the dial and it scrolls through these little pieces of information on the gauge cluster, letting you know like your fuel economy, your average speed, if there's a door open, that kind of thing. Not all that unusual to have that screen there, but a little strange to have it controlled with that little dial rather than like an up-down button on the steering wheel like virtually every other car. And next up, another interesting item in the glove box. That's where you'll find your owner's manual, which you can see is in an orange pouch. To match the orange of this interior, they give you an orange pouch for the owner's manual, which is kind of a funny touch. And speaking of storage in this car, one thing I never really did understand is this little storage slot, vertical, next to the radio. Not exactly sure what you're supposed to put in this small vertical slot, but they had some extra room, I guess, so they decided to make it a storage slot, even though it's not a particularly useful one. And next up, we move on to the back seat in the S60R. And the first thing you notice when you climb back here, aside from how orange it is that there's not all that much room in the back seat of this car. You can see I'm sitting back here, my knees are right up against the front seat, my head is right up against the headliner. It's pretty tight back here. And frankly, that's how all of the sports sedans from this era were of this size. You get into the back of a BMW 3 Series, an Audi A4, Mercedes C-Class from back in the early 2000s, and you'll find that adults really had to kind of fold themselves into the back seats. If you wanted more space, you really had to step up to a larger vehicle. It's just kind of how all the back seats were, including in the S60R. With that said, you did get a few nice amenities back here. For one thing, you have climate vents mounted on the B pillar. You can see them here to blow air onto the rear passengers. Strangely enough, these climate vents are the only thing back here that's beige. Everything else is orange, black, as you can see, but these vents and this pillar are beige, I guess to match the headliner, which is sort of a grayish beige as well. Too bad the climate vents aren't orange. That would have been interesting. One other nice feature back here, you do have an outlet here in the center, in the back of the front center console. It's a cigarette lighter style outlet, but still it's a pretty nice touch for rear passengers to have an outlet almost 20 years ago. Not too many cars had that. You also do get cup holders back here, which is nice. You drop down this center armrest and then you tap this front panel and they open up for cup holders, which is also a nice touch for rear passengers in the S60R. One other interesting feature for the back, the owner of this car has this thing, which is like a Volvo accessory tray, he told me, that you're supposed to clip on to the back of the front seat, and then you can use it as a tray to sit in the back and like eat while you're driving along. This was an actual Volvo accessory that was sold like at dealerships. You can see Volvo is printed on the zippers. This was supposed to be something that you could use in back, I guess, to make your life a little easier if you wanted like a lunch on the go. Well, here's a little lunchbox that actually clips to the seat that you can use. Kind of a strange idea. And next up, we move on to the trunk of the S60R, the cargo area, which is unfortunately normal. I say unfortunately because it's just gray carpeting in here. How cool would it have been if the trunk carpeting was orange as well? Unfortunately, Volvo didn't do that, probably to save cost. They only did one carpeting color, regardless of what color you got for the interior. But some interesting things in this trunk. For one thing, it's pretty big. You look in at first, doesn't seem all that large, but it goes pretty far back. It's pretty deep in there, so you can get a lot of stuff. It also has a backrest release, which is pretty cool. You pull this little latch over on the passenger side to release the passenger side rear backrest, or the driver side releases the driver side rear backrest, and then the rear seats are unlocked, so you can push a large item through and the seats will fold down easily without you having to actually go to the back seats and unlatch everything if you want to get some big item in the trunk. But probably the coolest and most interesting trunk item in here is this panel. This gray panel on the floor actually lifts up and becomes a partition, which is kind of interesting. If you have some stuff in back that you don't want to interact with other stuff in back, like some breakable stuff and some bowling balls, you can use the partition in order to keep them separate, which is actually a neat idea. And frankly, I wish more cars had this feature. It's pretty simple. And next up, I want to move on to another really important point with this car, and that would be the design, the styling, the way it looks, which was a big deal back when this S60 came out. Prior to this model, Volvos were known for being boxy. They had a boxy look, and it really was sort of part of their brand identity. Volvos were boxy, safe, practical vehicles, and that's really what they were known for, the boxy design. Then this S60 came out in 2001, and I still remember it was a radical change. It had flowing lines, as you can see. The really big deal was this hip line in back, almost like a shoulder going all the way from the passenger compartment to the brake lights, and it looked totally different from anything Volvo had ever done. And then the S60R came out a few years later, and it really did make the best of this design. There were a few tweaks to add some performance-y, muscly look to this car, and it really looked cool, especially with these wheels. I've always loved the S60R 5-spoke wheels. Thin, flat spokes gave this car a very athletic, muscular look, and I really like the fact that R is printed on one spoke on each wheel, which was a cool, subtle touch to just remind everyone that this is the performance version. Now, speaking of that little R badge on the wheels, I mentioned Volvo didn't put a lot of R badges on this car, and that's true on the outside as well. You had that subtle R badge on the wheels, and it says R on the brake caliper. If you look closely, they're not red, they weren't too showy, but there is an R printed there to remind you of this car's sporty nature. You also had an R badge on the trunk, as you can see here, and a little R badge in the front grille, offset to the side and also pretty subtle, but it was a cool little badge that again denoted this car's sportiness, the R. And by the way, since I'm talking about the front of this car, one important and quirky little detail, this car has headlight wipers. You can see here, you get 2 windshield wipers and 2 more wipers on the headlights. So when you would wash the windshield, it would also spray water on the lights, and those wipers would clear whatever debris had accumulated. Headlight wipers became kind of a common thing in luxury cars in the late 80s and early 90s, but this may have been one of the very last cars to have the feature, as most cars today just have washer jets without an actual wiper on the headlights. But probably the very best part of this car, aside from the colors, is the engine. This powertrain, which was a 2.5 liter turbocharged 5-cylinder that made 300 horsepower. That doesn't sound like a huge amount today, but it was a big deal back then, especially for Volvo. An earlier predecessor to this car, the 850R, had only 240 horsepower, and it was front-wheel drive and only offered with an automatic here in the States. This one, 300 horses, all-wheel drive, and available manual transmission. It really brought Volvo into contention with some serious performance sedans. And when you looked at them on paper, this was pretty close. Like I said, this had 300 horsepower. The Audi S4 from this time had 340. The BMW M3 had 333, and the AMG version of the Mercedes C-Class had 349. So this at 300 horsepower with a manual transmission and all-wheel drive, it was kind of knocking on their doors. And of course, this was cheaper, which also helped draw some buyers in who maybe didn't want to spring for an S4 or M3. They could sort of compromise on this and still get a pretty high performance car. Now, one other thing I want to mention under the hood here, you can see on the engine, the R printed here again. Just to remind everybody who popped the hood, this wasn't your usual Volvo, but the high performance R version. And so those are the quirks and features of the Volvo S60R. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the S60R. I have waited a long time to film a video reviewing this car, and I get emails all the time from S60R and V70R owners saying, hey, why haven't you filmed a video with my car yet? You know, come on. The reason is I was waiting for a flash screen over Atacama with a manual transmission, which is pretty much non-existent, and yet here it is. Now, I have an interesting personal history with the S60R. My very best friend when I was in high school, he had one of these, and that was a big deal at the time. Nobody in my high school really had any money. We didn't have any new cars, but this was new then. His family had a little more money, and this was new, and This was the coolest thing any of us could possibly imagine at the time. I just remember being in total shock and awe over this vehicle. You know, our parents all drove Toyotas and Fords, and this was like a supercar to us, effectively. Now, some people are gonna ask, why didn't I review the V70R, which is of course the station wagon version of this car? And I have to say, I'm a huge station wagon fan. I love wagons. They did do the V70R in this color combo. I prefer the sedan. This is maybe the only car in history where I prefer the sedan. And the reason for that is I think the V70R looked weird. It had this boxy rear end like a wagon, but it had this new sort of stylish, curvy front end design that Volvo was debuting on the S60 and the rest of its cars. And I think that things were just discordant. They didn't really work together all that well. And I've always felt the V70 was a little weird looking, sort of curvy and flowy in front and then just a box in the back. It was just too weird. But it worked perfectly on the S60, which was a beautiful car, and then the R came out and it was the performance version, so let's talk performance. First thing about this car, I love the shifter, believe it or not. It's weird, but it works great. Not only does it work great, but it just is great. Like, the clutch is very easy, very simple to figure out. The shifter feels good. It's perfectly weighted. Honestly, this feels just as good or better than a lot of BMW shifters I've driven. They can be a little bit rubbery. This one feels a little bit more precise, and there's no play in it. Very easy to shift into gear. Perfect weight of the shifter and the clutch. I'm surprised, honestly, very surprised by how good it is. Now, interestingly, I haven't driven one of these in years, probably since my friend had one, so I'm kind of curious. Wow, it's quick. I remember it being quick back then, and honestly, I still feel that way. This car is quick. Now, I remember that these had some pretty substantial turbo lag, but I'm not really feeling that here. Kind of surprised by that, actually, because that was one of my big memories of the S60R. But driving this car, it feels not really laggy at all. There's a little low-end lag, but it's a pretty good setup. And if you keep it higher in the rev range, man, this car is quick. Properly and seriously quick. Even 17 years later, this car still feels like a pretty strong performance car with a pretty muscular engine. Now, it's worth noting this engine was a big deal back then. Turbo engines weren't a thing. Some cars had them, but most didn't. And you know, the M3 back then was naturally aspirated. The V8 S4, the AMG C-Class was actually supercharged, but turbos were not what they are now. And all-wheel drive was not even all that common. This car was a little bit of a trailblazer in that respect. Where this car starts to fall apart a little bit, and I remember this being true then, and it's still true, is turning, handling, steering. The steering is not tremendously precise, which is already a little bit of a drawback for a performance car. You know, you want relatively quick and connected steering, but for cars from this era, that wasn't really all that common, and so you can kind of forgive it. In the early 2000s, really quick steering, immediacy wasn't a big thing, but you at least want good handling. So when you go around the corner, the car stays super flat, poised, you can step on it, you know, it doesn't get squirrely. This particular car, not even really all that great at that. At the end of the day, the S60 was a front-wheel drive, sort of mid-size, you know, conservative adult luxury car. You know, it wasn't intended to be a performance car. They were able to get a lot out of this chassis, and changing through the settings, you do get a little bit of adjustment. If you go into sport or advanced, you do feel a little bit more performance. But there's body roll in this car. There's sort of a non-immediacy to the handling that is a little disappointing. It's just not incredibly fast or sporty. Overall, though, I gotta say, I'm surprisingly impressed with this car. It's been 10 years since I drove one of these, but I like this car. I like how it shifts. I like how it feels. Honestly, I'm pretty surprised. I like how it drives. The clutch, the shifter is great. It accelerates a lot quicker than I think, and I think personally a lot quicker than most people would realize from a 20-year-old Volvo performance car. But to me, the real cool thing here is the colors. I mean, it's absolutely one of the stupidest things I've ever seen in my entire life. And if I'm being totally honest, it's not attractive. It's kind of heinous. Flash green over orange. What the hell? Now, as I say that, it would be the only color I would ever want to get this car in. It was so cool, but I don't know what they were thinking creating it, and I'm not surprised that only a few people bought it. The last time I saw a flash green over Atacama S60R was in Savannah, Georgia in 2012. I still remember being freaking out then. I went 9 years between sightings till this car here, and they just don't exist anymore. But I'm thrilled that this one does exist, and I was thrilled to spend the day with it and laugh at this ridiculous color combo. And so that's the Volvo S60R. 300 horsepower, all-wheel drive, manual transmission, adaptive chassis. It's all pretty cool, but flash green over Atacama. Truly, truly insane. I am glad I held out so long on reviewing an S60R until I could find one in this color combination. And you can buy it on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the S60R a Doug's score. And the Doug score is here, 50 out of 100, which places it here against other 2000s sports sedans. The S60R is behind all the heavy hitters like the BMW M5 and the M3, but that's no surprise. This car was always positioned lower than those, both in terms of price and performance. Honestly, I enjoyed driving the S60R more than I expected, especially with 3 pedals. It's quicker than you think, surprisingly agile, and the transmission is surprisingly decent. And this color combination is probably my all-time favorite factory offering on any car ever.